You knew it was only a matter of time before Hyundai built a small hybrid to take on the Toyota Prius. But does this new Ioniq have what it takes to compete with the car that's come to define what a hybrid should be? It doesn't take long when you're behind the wheel of this Prius to realize that the latest version is absolutely the best one yet. Toyota's really got the ride and handling dialed in really nicely, and it's really comfortable and smooth, both out on the highway and around town. There's not a whole lot to complain about with the way it rides, and the same goes with the steering. They've added a lot of communication that just wasn't there in the last generation. And no, it's not a sports car, but it's got a little bit more feel and feedback to it when you turn a corner. You can actually feel what the car is doing and feel it respond to inputs as opposed to just sort of float its way through. It's really nice, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for what they've done to make this thing just a little bit more agile compared to the last version. It's also no surprise that after almost 20 years of building the Prius, Toyota's really got this hybrid powertrain figured out. And this thing switches between the gas and electric power sources pretty effortlessly and uneventfully. And you only really notice the gas engine running when your foot's pressed right to the floor if you're merging onto the highway. That's the only time that the gas engine really makes itself known. Otherwise, even when it's running, it's not all that loud and clattery. There is a little bit of road and wind noise that makes its way into the cabin, but I think that's more a product of a lack of sound insulation. You know, in a hybrid like this, it's all about fuel economy, and that means less weight, the better. And so it suffers in that department. Today it's been raining, and you do hear a lot of that rain, even with insulated glass on the driver and passenger side windows and the windshield. There's still quite a bit of noise that makes its way inside, though it's not uncomfortable, and you can still host a conversation without a problem. When it comes to the powertrain, this thing uses a 1.8 liter gas engine that runs on the Atkinson cycle, as well as a small electric motor and a continuously variable transmission. And power isn't exactly abundant. I mean, it only makes 121 horsepower combined, but it's plenty once you get up to highway speed. You do need a little bit more skinny pedal to get it there, but once you get rolling, it's not a problem keeping it there. Passing needs a little bit more preparation time. You need to anticipate what's coming in order to pass slower traffic. But let's be honest, when you're driving a Prius, you probably are going to be that slower traffic, so you're not going to have that problem. Of course, as a hybrid, this Prius does have regenerative brakes, and they're not as grabby as the ones in the Chevy Volt, for example, but you can feel them working a little bit, though there is quite a bit of pedal travel off the top, and they do feel a little bit awkward and rubbery, and they almost feel like a conventional car's brakes when they start to fade and they're getting close to that time when they need to be replaced. There's just a little bit of that wonky pedal travel that I don't really like, but you do get used to it pretty quickly. Over the course of the week that I've had this thing, I've gotten pretty comfortable with those oddities that are sort of baked into a hybrid car and you do have to adjust to as time goes on. Not to dwell on styling too much here because I know it's so subjective, but when you park the Prius and Ioniq next to each other, you can definitely tell that they're cut from the same cloth. They have those same sort of quirky characteristics that are indicative of a hybrid car, though it's definitely pretty obvious that the Prius is just a little bit weird. It's got that really pointy front end and those really tall taillights. It's all sort of futuristic and weird, and the same goes for the cabin. That quirkiness translates directly into here with this awkward white plastic on the center console and this shifted display that is meant to be your gauge cluster, but in my opinion, it just doesn't work. It puts everything way too far away from the driver, and the display is so small that you have to sort of strain your eyes to read it all. I just think it's poorly designed, and it's time for Toyota to bring back a traditional gauge cluster. Now, when it comes to that awkward display, the Prius does strike back with an available head-up display that puts some relevant driving information directly in front of the driver. It's also available with just about every other option you can think of, including things like wireless phone charging and adaptive cruise control. Now those are available on higher trim grades, and it's a nice package that means that it suits drivers of all tastes and budgets. Now, unfortunately, no matter how high up the trim ladder you climb, the Prius isn't available with real leather, and instead it gets this awful feeling soft-tex man-made stuff that feels almost like a hospital gurney mattress. It's just not nice at all, and it looks cheap too. I really think this is a fail. Otherwise, this cabin isn't too bad. Now, just a few other complaints I have about the cabin of this Prius includes this awkwardly large blind spot created by the rear view mirror, as well as this really uncomfortable and upright seating position. Even when you adjust the lumbar support, it just feels like you're sort of being pushed outwards, and I don't like it very much. I also hate this joystick-like lever. I know the Prius is supposed to be sort of a technology showcase for Toyota, and it doesn't need traditional cables for the shifter and can be shift by wire, but I just think this thing is a bit of a fail. It's also awkward that you have to reach outside of the shifter to hit a park button. I know over time that's something that drivers will get used to, but for a first-time driver stepping into this car, it is a little bit weird to get used to looking for this park button as opposed to putting the shifter in park like a traditional shifter should. As you would imagine, the Ioniq has a really similar powertrain setup to the one found in the Prius. Now this thing uses a 1.6 liter gas engine that runs on the Atkinson cycle as opposed to the 1.8 liter found in the Prius. But it's also unique because its electric motor is wedged between that gas engine and a 6-speed automatic transmission as opposed to a continuously variable one. And that makes the Ioniq unique as one of only 2 hybrids on the market to feature a proper gearbox. Most feature CVTs because they can get away with that. They have that instant torque, so there's no need for gears to build up that engine speed and run through as the pace picks up in the car. This thing uses that to make it feel a little bit more like a conventional car, and it is pretty successful. Now, just because the Ioniq feels more like a conventional gas-powered car doesn't mean it feels like one altogether, and there is a lot of that familiar hybrid feel here. Stuff like the gas pedal not necessarily feeling like it's connected to throttle response, especially when the car is switching between gas and electric motors. It does feel like it's a little bit slow, and you do need to put your foot down just a little bit more to get that speed off the line. But hey, fuel economy is the name of the game here, and on that front, this thing does just fine. And when you need a little bit more pep, there is 139 net horsepower to work with, which is more than what's on offer in the Prius, and you do notice it a little bit. Now, in truth, most of that has to do with the gearbox and not necessarily the electric motor, but it does feel a little bit sprightly when you want it to, and sort of feels like an underpowered Hyundai Elantra. Now, the steering is fairly nimble, but it's not quite as sharp as the one in the Prius. It's got a little bit more of a disconnect, and it does feel a little bit more floaty, especially when you're at faster speeds. Cruising along, there's a lot of play on center in this steering wheel. Now, the suspension isn't quite as smooth as the setup in the Prius, but the ride does find a way to feel a little bit more engaging without verging completely on fun. And that's sort of an added bonus of this thing being a hybrid, that it does feel like you can play around with it a little bit more. Now, some of the drivetrain components make it very clear that Hyundai benchmarked the Prius when they were building this new Ioniq, and part of that is the regenerative brakes. They're not as grabby as some others on the market, namely the Chevy Volt, but it is a nice way to top up the battery, especially when you're out and about around town. Now, another similarity between the Ioniq and the Prius is the lack of sound insulation. Quite a bit of road noise makes its way inside of here, and it's sort of a two-sided coin. You want the weight to be kept to a minimum to improve fuel economy, but part of that is suffering through a little bit of a louder cabin. You especially notice it when you're by yourself. If you're having a conversation, it's not a problem at all. But if you have the radio off or you're making a phone call, you definitely notice a lot more road noise making its way inside than a gas-powered car like an Elantra. Now, as many similarities as these two share, the Ioniq definitely looks more like a conventional car than the Prius, and that's especially true inside. It's really clean and comfortable and familiar in here. You don't feel like this is an oddball hybrid car. It does nothing to really stand out as different than any other gas-powered compact car. Just like in the Prius, this driver's seat is a little awkward and uncomfortable, and the lumbar support just really digs into your back. There's also a little bit less headroom in here when you have this optional sunroof along for the ride. As you can see, I'm pretty tall, but my head is pretty much digging into the roof. It's not great, but it's not horribly uncomfortable, and if you're of average height, you're not going to notice it at all. Now, just like the Prius, there is a lot of plastic in this cabin, but overall, the quality of the materials just feels a lot nicer, right down to the upholstery on the seats. In upper grade trims, it gets proper leather, which compared to the Softex in the Prius is way nicer. Now, you're not going to mistake it for Mercedes quality, but it is pretty nice to the touch, and it does feel like it's nice and rugged, and it's going to stand up to everyday wear and tear. And speaking of upper grade trims, just like the Prius, the Ioniq can be decked out with every feature imaginable, right down to safety features like autonomous emergency braking, lane keep assist, and adaptive cruise control, and other convenience features like wireless phone charging. But my favorite part is that Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is along for the ride, and that's something not even offered in the Prius. I don't think it's an absolute necessity, but once you get used to it, you'll definitely come to appreciate it. And for that reason, I think it's got a huge advantage over the Toyota. But hands down, the biggest advantage the Ioniq packs compared to the Prius is its price. The Prius starts right around 25 grand and tops out somewhere in the mid 30s, but this thing starts at right about $22,000 and tops out around $30,000, and that is quite a substantial amount of savings. Now, whether you're talking about the Prius or the Ioniq, both will save you quite a bit of money at the pumps. The Prius is rated at about 52 mpg combined, depending on which trim you're talking about, and the Ioniq right around 55 mpg, but we were able to net closer to 59 miles per gallon in both of them, and we weren't trying all that hard. Yeah, you do have to get used to driving a little bit slower, accelerating slower off the line, but once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad, and it's an easy way to save gas. The efficiency coaches in both cars are also a huge help. Now, the ones in the Prius are a little bit more robust and well-rounded than the ones here, but even the ones in the Ioniq are pretty good, and they give you a driving score to know how efficiently you are driving. So the Hyundai Ioniq Hybrid probably isn't going to pry many Prius fans out of their favorite Toyota, and that's totally understandable. It's got a cult-like following for a pretty good reason, and it's only one that's gotten better with age. But if it were my money, I'd take the Ioniq any day. It's cheaper, better looking, and just a little easier to live with.